In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Thousands of people had gathered beside the Ganges River for a major religious ceremony. A newborn baby was about to receive his first blessing in front of priests and pilgrims. But the moment the ritual began, the baby suddenly spoke a name no one expected. Within seconds, the peaceful ceremony turned into shock and chaos, and the entire crowd froze in disbelief. What did this newborn baby say? That changed the lives of hundreds of priests forever. Let's discover the full story behind this shocking event. Welcome to the YouTube channel Truth and Belief. The first light of dawn slowly spread across the ancient city of Haridwar. A soft golden glow touched the flowing surface of the Ganges River as the sun rose behind the distant hills. The cool morning air carried the scent of jasmine flowers and burning incense drifting through the narrow streets that led toward the sacred riverbank. Thousands of pilgrims had already gathered near the wide stone steps beside the river. Their colorful clothes created a moving sea of people as temple bells rang from different directions across the holy city. Today was not an ordinary morning. For weeks, the city had been preparing for a grand ceremony that many believed would shape the future of their spiritual tradition. Visitors had arrived from villages and cities across India to witness the rare ritual that would take place beside the Ganges. At the center of the gathering stood the most respected spiritual leader of the region, Acharya Vishwanath. For more than 20 years, he had guided thousands of followers as a teacher of sacred traditions. His words carried great authority, and his presence alone was enough to silence large crowds during religious gatherings. From the balcony of his stone residence overlooking the river, Acharya Vishwanath quietly observed the growing crowd below. His saffron robe moved gently in the cool morning wind. The bright color of the cloth symbolized spiritual authority and renunciation, a role he had carried with pride for many years. Behind him stood his wife, Ananya. In her arms rested their newborn son, wrapped carefully in soft white cloth. The baby was barely 40 days old, his tiny face peaceful and unaware of the attention waiting for him outside. Ananya looked toward her husband with a thoughtful expression. To everyone in the city this day was a celebration. But inside their home, both husband and wife carried a secret that no one else knew. Acharya Vishwanath slowly turned toward the child. For a long moment, he simply watched the baby's calm face. "Is everything ready?" he asked quietly. Ananya nodded. "The people have already gathered by the river," she replied softly. The distant sound of drums echoed through the streets as the ceremony preparations reached their final stage. Below the residence, the riverbank had been transformed into a magnificent ritual ground. Long rows of orange-robed priests stood in perfect formation around a decorated silver altar placed near the water's edge. Large ceremonial vessels filled with sacred water from the Ganges had been arranged beside the altar. Bowls of rose petals, sandalwood powder, and incense surrounded the vessels, releasing fragrant smoke that rose slowly into the morning sky. Temple drums began beating with a slow rhythmic pattern. Conch shells sounded across the valley, their deep notes echoing over the flowing river. The ceremony was about to begin. Pilgrims filled every visible space along the river steps. Many whispered excitedly about the newborn child who would soon be presented to the crowd. According to temple tradition, the child of a spiritual leader was blessed beside the sacred river during his first purification ceremony. Many believed the baby would one day become the next great teacher of Haridwar. Acharya Vishwanath stepped away from the balcony and began walking toward the wide marble staircase that led to the courtyard below. Temple attendants quietly opened the large wooden doors as he passed. His footsteps echoed softly in the silent hallway. Behind him, Ananya followed carefully while holding the baby close to her chest. Her heart beat faster with each step she took toward the courtyard where hundreds of priests were already waiting. When they emerged into the morning sunlight, the crowd erupted into loud chants of respect. "Acharya Vishwanath." The sound rolled across the courtyard like a powerful wave. Vishwanath raised one hand gently, signaling the crowd to quiet down. His face appeared calm, but inside his mind powerful thoughts were moving. For nearly 2 years, he had been living with a question that refused to leave his heart. Hidden in his private library, behind rows of ancient manuscripts. He had discovered a translated book that had slowly changed the way he looked at faith. It was a translation of the Quran. At first he had opened it only out of curiosity. He wanted to understand the teachings followed by millions of people across the world. But as the nights passed and he continued reading, something unexpected began happening inside him. The message of one creator, simple, powerful, and free from human images, began to challenge everything he had known. The idea that God needed no statues, no incense, and no complicated rituals unsettled his mind deeply. Meanwhile, unknown to him at first, Ananya had also begun searching quietly for the truth. During her pregnancy, she had secretly learned about Islam from an elderly Muslim woman who worked near the outer temple walls. Late at night, when the palace was silent, she would sit alone and whisper words of faith to the child growing inside her womb. She often spoke softly about the oneness of God, and about the life and character of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, whose message she had learned about through gentle conversations with the old woman. Now, standing beside the Ganges with thousands of people watching, both husband and wife felt that the moment they had feared for months had finally arrived. The priests formed a wide circle around the silver altar as Acharya Vishwanath approached the riverbank. Temple guards carefully cleared a path through the crowd. The sound of drums slowly faded. The ceremony had reached its most important moment. A large silver vessel filled with sacred river water had been placed on the altar. According to tradition, the baby's lips would touch the holy water as a symbol of blessing and spiritual purity. Ananya carefully placed the baby in her husband's arms. The crowd became completely silent. Thousands of people watched as Acharya Vishwanath gently dipped his fingers into the silver vessel. A small drop of water shimmered on his fingertips as he slowly lifted his hand toward the baby's lips. No one moved. Even the wind seemed to pause. Every eye remained fixed on the child. At that exact moment, the baby suddenly opened his eyes, and something unexpected began to happen. The baby's eyes opened slowly, dark and clear, reflecting the golden morning light of the rising sun. For a brief moment, Acharya Vishwanath felt as if the child was not simply waking from sleep but observing everything around him with an awareness far beyond his age. The entire riverbank remained silent. Thousands of people watched as Vishwanath carefully brought his fingers closer to the baby's lips. The small drop of sacred water glimmered in the sunlight. Just before the water touched the child's mouth, the baby gently turned his head away. A faint murmur moved through the crowd. Priests standing near the altar exchanged uneasy looks. According to temple tradition, infants always accepted the sacred water during purification rituals. A refusal, even from a newborn, was considered deeply unusual. Acharya Vishwanath remained calm. He gently adjusted the baby in his arms and tried once again. The drop of water moved closer to the child's lips. But the baby closed his mouth tightly and turned his face away a second time. The priests began whispering among themselves. "Why is the child refusing?" one of them murmured nervously. Another priest frowned and leaned closer, studying the child carefully. The silence along the riverbank slowly turned into quiet confusion. Acharya Vishwanath felt the growing tension around him, but he continued the ritual. He leaned forward slightly and lifted the sacred water again. At that moment, the baby suddenly opened his mouth. But instead of crying like an ordinary infant surrounded by noise and strangers, a clear sound came from his lips. "Muhammad." The word was soft, but unmistakably clear. For a few seconds, no one reacted. The river seemed to stop flowing. Then the baby spoke again. "Muhammad." The sound carried through the microphones placed around the ceremony area and echoed across the riverbank. A ripple of shock spread through the crowd. Some priests stepped backward in disbelief. Others stared at the baby as if they had witnessed something impossible. Then the child repeated the word a third time. "Muhammad." This time the sound spread clearly across the entire gathering. Thousands of people heard the same word at the same moment. The silence shattered. A tray of fruit offerings slipped from a priest's hands and crashed onto the stone floor beside the altar. Apples rolled across the ground as people stared at the child with wide eyes. "That name," one senior priest whispered. "It cannot be." The joyful ceremony instantly transformed into confusion. Several priests rushed toward the altar with anger written across their faces. "Did you hear what the child said?" One of them shouted. "Who taught him that name?" The name carried enormous weight. It referred to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the final messenger in Islam, a name rarely spoken during temple rituals. For many of the priests, hearing that name during a sacred ceremony felt like a direct challenge to their tradition. Voices began rising across the riverbank. "This is dark magic," one priest shouted. "The child has been cursed," another yelled. Within seconds, the peaceful gathering turned into chaos. Some priests demanded that the ceremony stop immediately. Others insisted the baby should be taken away and examined by temple authorities. Acharya Vishwanath remained standing in the center of the altar. He held the baby firmly against his chest. The child had grown quiet again. A faint smile rested on his tiny face as if nothing unusual had happened. Pandit Shastri, the most powerful priest in the temple council, pushed through the crowd and climbed the steps toward the altar. His eyes burned with anger. "What have you done, Vishwanath?" he demanded loudly. "You have allowed foreign words to insult this sacred ceremony." Acharya Vishwanath looked directly at him without fear. "I have done nothing," he answered calmly. "You all heard the child yourselves." Pandit Shastri shook his head sharply. "A baby cannot speak like that without influence," he said harshly. "Someone has planted these words in his mind." The crowd grew louder with every passing moment. Some people shouted that the child was cursed. Others looked frightened, unsure whether they had witnessed a miracle or a terrible omen. Temple guards quickly formed a protective circle around the altar as the noise of the crowd continued rising. Ananya stepped closer to her husband. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked at the angry faces surrounding them. Tears filled her eyes, but her lips moved quietly as she whispered a silent prayer asking God for protection. In the middle of the chaos, Acharya Vishwanath raised his voice. "Everyone, calm yourselves," he called out. But the crowd was no longer listening. Rumors spread rapidly through the thousands gathered near the river. Some believed the baby had spoken by divine will. Others insisted the family had betrayed their sacred traditions. Several priests began climbing the stone steps toward the altar, demanding that the child be taken away. The situation was quickly becoming dangerous. A temple guard leaned toward Vishwanath and spoke urgently. "Acharya, we must leave now. This place is no longer safe." Realizing the crowd was losing control, the guards formed a tight shield around the family. Vishwanath, Ananya, and the baby were quickly guided away from the altar through a narrow passage behind the temple structure. The angry voices of the crowd echoed behind them. Inside the hidden stone corridor, the sound of shouting continued bouncing off the walls. Vishwanath walked quickly while holding the baby close to his chest. The child remained calm, resting peacefully in his arms. Ananya followed beside him, her heart beating fast with fear. "What will happen to us now?" she whispered. Vishwanath did not answer immediately. Deep inside, he already knew the truth. The life he had lived for decades had changed forever. The name spoken by the child had shaken the authority of the temple, and the powerful priests who controlled the city would never ignore such a challenge. When they reached the outer gate of the temple compound, armed guards were already waiting. Pandit Shastri had acted quickly. Under the direct order of the temple council, Acharya Vishwanath and his family were placed under arrest. They were no longer treated as respected leaders. They were now accused of betraying their sacred tradition. As the heavy iron gates of the temple prison slowly closed behind them, the distant roar of the angry crowd continued echoing across the ancient city of Haridwar. And deep inside the stone corridors of the temple, Acharya Vishwanath realized something important. The real conflict had only just begun. The underground prison of the temple was cold, silent, and dimly lit. Thick stone walls trapped the damp air inside the narrow corridor, and a faint beam of sunlight entered through a small crack near the ceiling. Acharya Vishwanath sat quietly against the rough wall of the cell. In his arms, the baby rested peacefully as if the heavy iron bars and the cold floor meant nothing to him. The noise of the angry crowd outside had faded into distant echoes, but the tension within the temple had not disappeared. Beside him, Ananya sat with her back against the stone wall. Her face showed exhaustion, yet there was a strange calmness in her eyes. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The baby moved his tiny fingers slightly and then returned to a peaceful sleep. Finally, Vishwanath broke the silence. "Ananya," he said softly. She looked up. "Do you regret what has happened today?" The question hung in the quiet air of the cell. Ananya took a slow breath. "No," she answered gently. "I feared this day for many months, but I never regretted the path that led us here." Her voice was steady. Vishwanath looked down at the child in his arms. "I knew something like this might happen," he admitted quietly. Ananya's eyes widened with surprise. "You knew?" He nodded slowly. "For the past 2 years," he explained, "I have been searching for answers that the temple rituals could never give me." He leaned his head back against the stone wall. "Every day I stood before thousands of people performing ceremonies," he continued. "Yet every night I returned home with the same question in my heart." He paused for a moment. "One evening in Delhi, while walking through an old book market, I discovered a book covered in dust." He looked at Ananya. It was a translation of the Quran. Ananya remained silent as he continued speaking. "At first I opened the book out of curiosity," Vishwanath said. "I wanted to understand the message that millions of people follow. But the more I read, the more restless my heart became." He described how the words spoke about one creator who had no partners and no physical form. A God who did not require statues, incense, or elaborate rituals. "The message was simple," he said quietly. "One God, one creator. No intermediaries between a person and their Lord." Ananya lowered her head slightly. "I was walking the same path," she whispered. Vishwanath looked at her with surprise. "You were." She nodded. "When I became pregnant," she explained, "I began thinking about the life our child would grow into." She gently placed her hand on the baby's back. "I did not want him to grow up believing things that even our hearts doubted." She told him about an elderly Muslim woman who worked near the outer walls of the temple. The woman often spoke quietly about faith. She spoke about the character and mercy of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and about the belief that every human being is born with a natural awareness of one creator. "I began learning quietly from her," Ananya said. "Every night when the palace became silent, I sat alone in my room." She looked at the baby with deep emotion. "I would place my hand on my stomach and whisper words of faith, so that our child would hear them before anything else." Vishwanath stared at her in thoughtful silence. "So while I was reading in secret," he said slowly, "you were teaching the same truth to our child." Ananya nodded. For the first time since their arrest, a faint smile appeared on Vishwanath's face. "It seems we were walking the same road without knowing it," he said softly. Just then the sound of metal keys echoed through the corridor outside the cell. Both of them turned toward the iron bars. Footsteps approached slowly. A young priest appeared carrying a small torch. It was Rohan, one of Vishwanath's most devoted students. His face looked troubled as he stopped in front of the cell. "Teacher," he said quietly. Vishwanath stood and stepped closer to the iron bars. "Rohan." The young priest looked around carefully to make sure no guards were listening. "I was ordered to watch you tonight," he whispered. "But that is not why I came." His voice trembled slightly. "I cannot stop thinking about what happened beside the river." The torchlight flickered across his worried face. "That baby, your son." The way he spoke the name of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Rohan swallowed nervously. "I have studied many sacred texts," he said, "but nothing I have ever heard has shaken my heart the way that moment did." Vishwanath listened silently. "Teacher?" Rohan asked softly. "Was it really a miracle?" Vishwanath looked at the young man with kindness. "A miracle is not always something loud and dramatic," he replied. "Sometimes it is simply the moment when truth breaks through the walls we build around our hearts." Rohan's expression filled with confusion. "But if what you say is true," he asked. "Does that mean everything we have believed is wrong?" Vishwanath did not answer immediately. He looked back at Ananya and the sleeping child. "The greatest mistake a human can make," he finally said, "is recognizing the truth but refusing to accept it because it threatens their position." Rohan lowered his head. "I do not know what to believe anymore," he admitted. Slowly, he reached into his robe and placed a small iron key on the ground beside the cell door. "I cannot openly help you," he whispered, "but I cannot stand against you either." With that, he turned and quietly walked away down the corridor. The flickering light of his torch slowly disappeared into the darkness. Inside the cell, Vishwanath looked down at the small key lying on the stone floor. The future was uncertain, but something had begun to change inside the temple walls. Doubt was spreading, and beyond the prison, the world had already begun hearing about the baby who had spoken a name that no one expected. The night inside the temple prison passed slowly. The cold air of the underground chamber felt heavier with every hour, yet outside the stone walls the city of Haridwar was growing restless. News of the speaking baby had already spread beyond the temple gates. One pilgrim had secretly recorded the moment beside the Ganges River. By evening the video had reached social media, and within hours thousands of people across India had watched the unbelievable scene. Reporters and curious visitors began arriving in the city. Some believed it was a miracle. Others believed it was a dangerous rumor. Inside the temple council chamber, the senior priests gathered for an emergency meeting. Pandit Shastri sat at the center of the room, his face tense with anger and worry. For decades, he had been one of the most powerful religious leaders in Haridwar. But now the situation was slipping beyond his control. "If we do not act quickly," one priest said nervously, "people will begin questioning everything we teach." Another priest spoke with concern. "The crowd outside the temple continues to grow. Some demand punishment for Vishwanath, but others want to hear him speak." Pandit Shastri struck the wooden table with his hand. "This scandal must end," he said firmly. After a long discussion, the council reached a decision. Acharya Vishwanath would be brought before the people the next morning. They believed that under pressure he would deny everything and restore the authority of the temple. Early the next morning, the heavy iron door of the prison cell opened. Several guards entered and ordered Vishwanath and his family to come with them. Without resistance, Vishwanath stood and lifted the baby into his arms. Ananya walked beside him as they followed the guards through the long stone corridor toward the temple courtyard. When they stepped outside, the bright morning light revealed a massive crowd gathered in front of the main temple balcony. Thousands of people filled the open square. Some faces showed anger. Others showed curiosity. Temple guards stood in long lines between the crowd and the temple entrance. Pandit Shastri appeared on the balcony above the courtyard and raised his hand. "My people," he announced loudly. "Today Acharya Vishwanath will correct the misunderstanding that has disturbed our sacred city." The crowd slowly quieted. Vishwanath was guided onto the balcony beside him. The baby rested calmly in his arms, looking out across the sea of people below. Pandit Shastri handed Vishwanath a small bowl filled with sacred ash. "If you place this on the child's forehead and declare that yesterday's event was a mistake," Shastri said quietly, "your honor will be restored." For a moment Vishwanath said nothing. He looked down at the bowl in his hand. Then he slowly lifted his eyes toward the crowd. Thousands of people waited for his answer. Instead of speaking immediately, Vishwanath placed the bowl gently on the balcony floor. A murmur spread through the gathering below. Then he reached up to the shoulders of his saffron robe. For decades the robe had symbolized his spiritual authority. With a calm movement, he untied it and let it fall to the ground. Gasps rose from the crowd. Standing now in a simple white garment, he spoke clearly. "For many years," he began, "you respected me because of these robes and the rituals I performed." The courtyard became completely silent. "But inside my heart, I was searching for something I could not find." He paused for a moment. 2 years ago, I began reading a book that spoke about one creator who needs no statues, no images, and no complicated ceremonies. The people listened carefully. That book spoke about the message brought by Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Whispers spread across the crowd. Vishwanath continued speaking. My son did not speak by magic beside the river yesterday. He simply repeated a truth that every human heart already knows. Pandit Shastri shouted angrily, ordering the guards to stop him. But something unexpected began happening among the priests standing below. One young priest slowly removed his orange robe and dropped it to the ground. Then another did the same. Within moments, several more priests stepped away from the temple ranks. The crowd watched in shock. Vishwanath raised his voice. I can no longer pretend, he declared. There is only one God worthy of worship. The wind moved gently across the courtyard. And Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the messenger who brought that truth to humanity. His words echoed across the square. Some people shouted in anger. Others began weeping quietly. An elderly Muslim man slowly stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. He had once worked near the temple walls and had quietly spoken with Ananya about faith. With emotion in his voice, he began guiding Vishwanath in reciting the declaration of belief. Vishwanath repeated the words clearly. His voice carried across the entire courtyard. Ananya stood beside him with tears streaming down her face. Several former priests fell to their knees, overwhelmed by what they had just witnessed. For many of them, the rituals they had followed for years had never brought peace to their hearts. But in that moment, they felt something different. A deep certainty. Pandit Shastri stood frozen with disbelief as the authority of the temple began collapsing before his eyes. The sun slowly moved westward, casting warm golden light across the flowing Ganges River. Later that evening, Vishwanath and those who had chosen the new path walked quietly through the streets of Haridwar. There were no robes, no titles, only people searching for truth. They reached a small mosque on the edge of the city. As the evening call to prayer echoed across the sky, Vishwanath looked down at his son. The baby smiled peacefully in his arms. The road ahead would not be easy. They would face rejection, loss of status, and perhaps even danger. But for the first time in his life, Vishwanath felt that his heart was truly free. And in the quiet streets of Haridwar, a new chapter of faith had begun.